This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Ziak and Tim Minichi.
Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. And this episode, Jay, was brought to us via the voting of our patrons. It is a poll episode. It is an 80s origins episode. And we have a guest joining us to help us out.
Nice.
He's returning. Welcome back, Keith Miller.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Our roundtable expert. He was here with our new metal roundtable, and now back for our 80s origins. Your knowledge it's quite large and spans multiple decades.
Indeed. I listen to so much music. I have like 4,000 CDs and
Dang.
I don't genres don't bother me. I listen to everything from like country to classical and anything in between, so.
Oh, that's excellent, because we've got a Debussy episode coming up soon. We're going to talk about some classical, maybe get into some Mozart and some Tchaikovsky. So
I'm a huge Tchaikovsky fan. He was like the punk rock of
exactly
of classical music. I love him.
Was he busy in the 90s?
Probably not. Maybe,
I'm sure he was on some soundtracks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I actually first started listening to him in the 90s. So,
well, everybody's heard the 1812 Overture. Even if they don't know, they've heard Tchaikovsky.
Sure. I mean, Nutcracker, all the stuff in the Nutcracker and Swan Lake is everywhere,
Well, I mean, if you've seen Caddyshack, you know
Right.
Tchaikovsky.
Right.
Let's just put it that way. So for this 80s origins poll, which we've done before, we did one on the early years of Soundgarden. We did one on the early years of Dinosaur Jr. We put up 3 bands who put out a pretty significant chunk of their catalog in the 80s before they blew up and became big bands in the 90s. Those 3 were The Flaming Lips, White Zombie, and Soul Asylum. I think some people would be shocked that White Zombie existed before the 90s.
Right.
I didn't know that until much later into their career. I thought that their first album was the one that had Thunder Kiss 65 on it. But no, they had multiple albums and singles and stuff out in the 80s. Flaming Lips famously did as well. I mean, they had a lot of records out in the 80s. And then Soul Asylum's the other one that I think maybe some people start with Gravedancer's Union and didn't even realize that they had this long 80s career. The voting for this episode shook out. Last place, White Zombie, 23%. Second place, Flaming Lips, 31%, which means our winner was Soul Asylum with 46% of the vote and none of the comments.
None of the comments. Isn't that the way?
Gavin went with White Zombie. He said interesting choices, but he liked their early stuff, so he went with them. Jim Copney said it's got to be talked about the Lips. Rich Trove for discussion. Ian McIver, White Zombie. A shame how unceremoniously they broke up. Only Jeremy Amend even mentioned Soul Asylum. He said obligatory comment regarding Soul Asylum in case they win. So there's the lone voter who spoke up for this episode.
Well done.
That's awesome.
So let me ask you guys, what's your familiarity with Soul Asylum overall, and then also the 80s era of the band? Keith, I'll start with you.
Okay, so honestly, I didn't get into Soul Asylum until Gravedancers Union. The local radio station played Somebody to Shove, and that song is brilliant. I mean, it's like if you don't like hear the at the beginning and just grabs you. I mean, so I love that album. And then I got a Columbia House mailer that said get into grunge, and one of the albums on there was And the Horse They Rode In On, but that's still 90s.
Right.
that album is really good too. It's like you can tell they're crossing into away from like their heavier stuff into their more pop stuff. It's got like the first time they really mixed acoustic instruments into their sound.
Mm-hmm.
I really really like that album. But then, and I got all their '90s stuff. I have every '90s album, but it's really those two. Like they're one of my favorite bands, but it's really those two albums that I go back to all the time.
Got it.
I eventually picked up Hang Time, which Hang Time you can tell is kind of a progression. Um, that's the first time you hear like the uh, Dave Pirner like do a lot of the vocal inflections that he did later on. Um, and I like that album a lot. But honestly, the rest of the '80s stuff I listened to this week to get ready to be on here.
Got it.
And it's interesting. Honestly, every single album is a progression. Like you can hear them bring stuff in from each album, but none of the albums really sound the same. It's pretty cool. I dig it.
Jay,
So,
what about you? I know you're familiar with some of the '90s stuff. Had you listened to any '80s stuff prior?
I think I had at one point checked out And the Horse They Rode In On, but nothing, and that's '90s album. I knew they had a large catalog in the '80s. I remember the parody album cover of Clam Dip and Other Delights. So, but I don't know that other than Horse You Rode In On, I don't know that I ever checked anything else out. I sort of had a general idea of maybe what it was like.
Got it.
I do want to say though, I mean, as we get into this, it was interesting because two things popped about this band when I first heard them. One was that guitar intro. For what's the first single?
Somebody to shove.
somebody shove.
Because that was a little like there was like a technical ability there, and just you're like, this is a little different than Nirvana. But then the rest of it was like very akin to like what was going on in grunge. And then the album after that, with
What's that? Candy for a Stranger?
No, that's Misery is the first
Like,
single off of
the song Misery.
yeah.
When that came out, I remember thinking, whoa, like there's more to this band than maybe some of these singles to this point let on, because that song has such a weird hook to it. I mean, it's really effective, but it shows like maybe an interest in like prog and some other things that like were not on the surface of at least to that point for me. So those two moments for me kind of got me interested in the band in general. And then as I go back now and listen to this catalog, we'll get into it, but some of that all starts to make more sense.
Got it. Okay. So my history is I really didn't know the band until Gravedancers Union, but it's also around the time that I got a new roommate in college who, unbeknownst to me, was a Soul Asylum super fan when I met him. And he got into Soul Asylum, I believe, with And Horse We Rode In On. And then he had, Gravedancers Union, but he had all their early material on CD, which I had never seen before. I didn't even know. I mean, Soul Asylum was a new band essentially in the 90s for me. And so he played me songs off of Hang Time and off of the, early records. He had cassettes. There is and we'll get into it, but there is a cassette that was released in the 80s called Time's Incinerator, which was basically like outtakes and like EPs to get put together and stuff like that. Like that's how much of a fan he was, that he had this like not self-release because it was on Twin Tone, but you could only get it on cassette. And he had that, and I remember listening to that. And then because of the great interest in Soul Asylum and Dave Murphy and Dave Pirner, or Dan Murphy and Dave Pirner, who were the primary songwriters, that tangentially led us both to becoming interested in Golden Smog because they were in that band. At first it was the EP that they put out, which was just a collection of musicians: Jeff Tweedy from Wilco, Gary Loris from the Jayhawks. There was a guy named, I think, Noah something, I can't remember his last name. He was in a band called Run Westy Run. And then they occasionally had some other people show up, but they did a 5-song EP of all covers, which totally made sense to me when I heard it, because Soul Asylum would often do covers the way that Dinosaur Jr. would. Like Dinosaur Jr. famously covered like Just Like Heaven and these songs. And Soul Asylum was covering like Foreigner and these songs that you would not expect them to cover. And that's what Golden Smog was kind of about too, with covering Bad Company, and then that led into the later Golden Smog records also. We went and saw those guys, and we're like the super nerds, like trying to get everything autographed at the show. And anyway, long story short, I've been listening to this band for a long time. All the way up to, I've listened to all the records that they've put out up to Change of Fortune in 2016, which I enjoyed that one, even though it felt really like an attempt to make a pop record almost. It's super poppy in a lot of ways, and it doesn't necessarily feel like a Soul Asylum record. I have not listened to Hurry Up and Wait, which was the 2020 album. And then they just last month put out a new record called Slowly But Surely, Shirley spelled like the woman's name. So it's like an airplane joke from the 1970s. And I've been on board with this band since Grave Dancers Union and pretty much like 92, 93. So that's my backstory with the band. Have either of you ever seen them live?
No, I missed 2 chances to do it, unfortunately.
Jay, no. So I saw them once, but with my old roommate Charlie, after I moved down to Columbus, they played Columbus in like 98 or 99 at this venue called Mecca, which was typically a dance club, but they would occasionally have bands there. And they played on Halloween, and they just did all covers of different bands rather than doing their own set. And they did like TLC's Waterfalls and just a weird eclectic set of covers. They might have thrown a 1 or 2 original, like big hits in, but I think they did like they did old 70s rock stuff like Nazareth. And it was all over the place, and it was kind of a drunken mess at times, but it was a lot of fun to see a band just be like, we're throwing everything out. We're just going to have fun tonight. It's Halloween. Just like, we're going to party. And it ended up being in Columbus. So that was the only time I've ever seen them live.
Do you remember the band? This just made me think of this. Thelonious Monster.
I know the name, and I probably have heard something off them, but I don't remember what they sound like.
Okay, well, they had like their biggest radio hit at the time was Blood is Thicker Than Water. And they were touring to support it, and they did a show in Ithaca, and all they played was covers. And this show got the worst reviews ever, because everyone wanted to hear like, what the song that was on the radio. And they were just like, no, we're just going to we're going to do an hour of cover songs. So,
oh man,
that's wild.
Just made me think of that. Yeah.
Let me give you a little history on the band so that the people who are listening who maybe don't know.
History of the band.
They actually started out as a band called they were not called Soul Asylum. They started out as Loud Fast Rules, and that was in 1981. So we're talking about, they're young when they formed that band. And also, it's not the arrangement as it was back then. So Dave Pirner, when they originally formed, he was playing drums. And then he switched after like 2 years. It was him, Dan Murphy, and Karl Mueller. And for about 3 years, that was the lineup. Dave Pirner then switched to lead vocals, also saxophone, which again, this is the 80s.
Sure, why not?
You could get away with a saxophone.
Yeah.
Did anybody try out guitar?
No, I don't think so, but he did play piano.
Okay.
And then they brought in Pat Morley around 83 to play drums, and that's when they I think that's around the time when they actually changed their name, is 83. And then Pat Morley was only in the band for a year. Grant Young ended up replacing him in 84. Grant, and that's the sort of the core lineup for what we know is Soul Asylum. Dave Pirner on vocals and guitar, Dan Murphy on guitar and backing vocals, Karl Mueller on bass, and Grant Young on drums. That's from like 84 to the mid 90s. They did bring in at one point a keyboard player to cover that stuff, Joey Huffman, in after this album, after Grave Dancers Union came out, when they had to tour for that, they brought in a keyboard player. So they are one of those bands from the Minneapolis area, like the Replacements, like Husker Du, that were involved in the hardcore scene and got hooked up with Twin Tone Records. For their first 3 releases are all on Twin Tone, and then they signed to A&M for 2 records, Hang Time and The Horse They Rode In On. I don't think those did well enough for them to stick around, so they ended up then going to Columbia, and that's where Grave Dancers Union was released, and then the next 2 records as well, Let Your Dim Light Shine and Candy from a Stranger. Now, in the sessions for Grave Dancers Union, the producer of that record, Michael Bainhorn, who is a pretty big producer in terms of who he's worked with, like Red Hot Chili Peppers, Soundgarden, Korn, Marilyn Manson. He was not really happy with Grant Young's playing on drums. So they brought in another drummer named Sterling Campbell, and they ended up splitting the drum performance on that record, even though Sterling Campbell isn't credited as anything other than percussion. But by the end of those sessions, Grant Young was out and Sterling Campbell was the new drummer for the band. And he stayed in the band for a couple years. Then they brought in Ian Mussington in 1999, which was right after the Candy from a Stranger album came out. And that was their last one on Columbia. Then they signed to Legacy Records and released The Silver Lining. The Silver Lining has Michael Bland on drums, who was in Prince's band. And Tommy Stinson also plays bass on that record because Karl Mueller was diagnosed with cancer, and he was able to play some of the bass on that album, but not all of it. So they brought in Tommy Stinson. Obviously, he was an old friend from the Replacements, and a guy named John Fields, who was a producer and was the producer on their record. And then sadly, Karl Mueller passed away in June of 2005 from cancer. So after he passed away, there's been a lot of lineup changes since then with Soul Asylum. Their current lineup, Dan Murphy retired. He didn't want to tour anymore, and he wasn't into it anymore. So he retired. He was replaced by Justin Chabono in 2012, and then Ryan Smith replaced Justin on guitar and backing vocals in 2016, and that's been the lineup. Pirner, Ryan Smith, Winston Roy has been the permanent bass player after Karl passed away, and Michael Bland has been the drums. Fun fact, the connection between Prince and Soul Asylum doesn't end there.
Mm-hmm.
On their 2006 album, there's which is called The Silver Lining, the first song is called Stand Up and Be Strong. Prince covered that for his what would be a posthumous album, Welcome to America, that came out a few years ago. He was into 90s and 2000s alternative rock because he covered Foo Fighters at the Super Bowl. I don't know if you guys remember that. Yep. But he did not The Pretender. What's that other one, that the big single that was from the 2000s? I got another confession to make. I'm no fool. That song. What is that song called?
Best of You.
Okay, The Best of You. Prince covers that song at the Super Bowl when it was raining. out of the blue.
That's awesome.
Just decided to.
It's like he recorded a cover of "Every Day Is a Winding Road" too.
Yeah. So Prince likes his 90s alt rock. And then, as mentioned, they have released 2 albums in the 2020s on Blue Elan Records, which is an indie label out of California. Hurry Up and Wait in 2020, and Slowly But Surely just came out recently. And they're touring, I believe. I think like they're pretty much always touring on those like those like not festival, but when they put those 90s packages together. Yeah, with like Better Than Ezra and Gin Blossoms and Sponge and all those bands go out and do their little package tours. So that's the history of, for the most part, of Soul Asylum. Let's get into the records, gentlemen.
All right.
And we're just gonna get through them and talk about like, you know, what works, what doesn't work on each record briefly. We're not going to spend a full hour on each record, obviously. We'll spend a little time on each record and also talk about the progression of the band in terms of being songwriters, in terms of being in the recordings, all that kind of stuff. So the first album, Say What You Will, Clarence, that came out August of 1984 on Twin Tone Records, produced by Bob Mould of Husker Du, then Husker Du. Keith, I'll start with you. Give me your impressions of the debut record by Soul Asylum.
I had no idea that Soul Asylum was ever a hardcore punk band. Man, like the vocals are so different. I mean, honestly, I like hardcore, so I was into it. But it was way heavier than I was prepared for. Yeah, I mean that's the biggest thing. I was just blown away by how heavy it was.
Got it.
Yeah.
Jay, what are your impressions of the first record? Not by itself, and also like in comparison to what you know of the band.
Yeah, I was surprised with. To me, the first 2 tracks, "Long Day" and is it "Voodoo Doll"? They had like a kind of like a post-punk new wave vibe to me. I mean, obviously it's aggressive, it's loud, but there's also like this kind of focus on rhythm. And the drums are really solid, surprisingly, for this type of music and this type of production. I always assume the drums are just going to be like tinny and bashy.
Yeah.
And there's this interesting, like almost like punky new wave vibe going on for those songs that I did not expect. And then they threw you a curveball with some saxophone on Stranger. And you're like, okay, wait. Like, I mean, you can start to see like start putting these pieces together and start to feel out like where this band starts to wind up in the 90s. But I guess I didn't expect to hear all of those elements on their first record. I expected to be like, okay, first record is going to be like a loud, aggressive punk rock record from track 1 to 10 or whatever, however many they are. But like right out of the gate, you know, my ears perked up in terms of I'm hearing a little more depth than just straight up punk and hardcore. And I'm also hearing a saxophone, you know, so that's pretty ambitious for your first album. So that was my impressions.
Yeah, I concur with you. I was surprised going back to this record because the 80s stuff kind of, the first 3 or so records kind of meld together to me in my old brain. So hearing them again distinctly by themselves, they sound a lot more mature than I would expect from a new band. Essentially, I know that they were in Loud Fast Rules before this, but the lineup was different. Dave was playing drums and not singing and stuff. and or playing saxophone at that time. And unless he was playing saxophone and drums at the same time, which would be impressive. But like you mentioned, Jay, there is like a more of a new wave flavor than a strict hardcore flavor. I mean, you look at the run times, there's a 5-minute song on this record, or 2 5-minute songs on this record. I think you get a hint of the wordsmith that Dave Pirner would become. To me, Dave Pirner and Paul Westerberg are very similar in that they both seem like they're well-read guys. They both seem like people who would have a book on them all the time, probably a paperback stuffed in their back pocket. And you hear the plays on words, less so on this record, but more so going forward. But with a song like Religivision, that to me sounds like that's an 80s, punk hardcore kind of thing that you would expect, but in a 5-minute song that's a bit of a ride. It's a bit different than you expect. And like you said, with Stranger in the saxophone, it is not, you would not hear that song on like a Husker Du album. You might have heard that on an early Replacements record when they were like being much more wilder and having taking a lot more chances before they sort of streamline the sound a little bit with Pleased to Meet Me and Tim going forward. So I thought this really did fit in well with their contemporaries in Minneapolis in 1984. Like they were apparently like opening for Husker Du, like the little Husker Du, which makes total sense. What would be your standout track from this record, Jay?
Probably the first one, Long Day.
Okay. So, let me ask you, what's your first track, Keith? Because I showed Dragging Me Down is the first track.
I will have to look real quick here.
I'm listening to the deluxe version.
Okay, maybe they rearranged them when they released the deluxe version.
Yeah, let me see what I've got.
Dragging Me Down is more of a traditional hardcore track.
Right.
But I agree with
you. My first track would be
that's
Dragging Me Down.
Dragging Me Down is track 10 on the
interesting.
Oh, weird.
Okay. Must have been for the re-release that they did that. Which I reversed the names. The original release was Karl Sold the Truck, and then the re-release was Anything Can Happen, which was in 2018.
Okay.
So apparently for that, they must have changed it. But I agree with you. Long Day has there's elements of like Gang of Four on this record, and there's just stuff that I did not expect, and that kind of encapsulates it as well. What about you, Keith? Is there a particular song that you would highlight for people?
I really liked Masquerade.
Okay.
I remember when I was listening to it, I was kind of just going along, and then that song stuck out to me. I'm not sure why. I was just like, oh, cool. I think it was the vocals, because the vocals are very, to me, they're kind of one note on this album, except for that song.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I don't know. I just really like that song.
Again, more saxophone on that song.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like the Cramps or something in that
right
part.
Yeah, I like how it swings and kind of sticks out a little bit more. It made my ears perk up, so I was like, this song's interesting. So
2 years later, they in 86 they released three albums which is crazy. I mentioned so the first one was Made to Be Broken. That was January 18th of 1986. Then they also released the Times Incinerator compilation in June, and then in later that year they released While You Were Out. So they got a lot of recording done in 1985 and 86, or actually I guess 84, 85, because the first album came out at the start of 86. So this is the first record where I remember my roommate going like handing it to me and going, you gotta check this out. Like, if you like Soul Asylum and Grave Dancer's Union, you can sort of hear where they are starting out here. And I was like, okay. Where they're starting to like evolve. So Jay, I'll start with you. What works for you? What caught your ear on their first album of 86, Made to Be Broken?
I think you can start to hear some of the, I've always thought of this band as like a midwestern roots band at their core that, you know, brings a lot of angst and you know, some other ideas, but sort of at the core of who they are. And this is, I think, more, you can hear that come across here, like a band that grew up on 70s radio. And all that brought from like the first track, you hear that the guitar thing at the beginning, like that's super proggy. But then there's shades here of Cheap Trick. You know, you're hearing like piano come in, you know, which was popular in a lot of 70s rock. But done in a really weird way. So it's just, I think you're starting to get that sound defined where it's, you know, punk band meets Midwest classic rock band, I guess, on this record.
Yes. Keith, what about you? What stood out for you on Made to Be Broken?
Yeah, so the first thing that I noticed was this album is mixed like a Husker Du album.
Which again is produced by Bob Mould.
Right, which makes sense, yeah. Just the vocals are so Husker Du, like the way that they're mixed. And that was the thing that stuck out to me the most out of the whole thing, was how the vocals were mixed exactly like a Husker Du album, which I've now said 3 times. But I agree with Jay that you could kind of hear some of the twangier influences, like the country stuff kind of coming in a little more, and yeah, I mean, it's definitely a progression with more melody and things like that than the first album. But like I said, the mix was the biggest thing to me. I was like, wow, this, you know, sounds like Candy Apple or whatever. Like, it's craziness.
It does. It has a very similar production style to that. And like you guys, the advancement of their songwriting was really evident on this record. You mentioned that the lead to Tied to the Tracks is great. And then you get a song like Never Really Been, which was one of the singles that released, has nothing. I'm trying to think of, like, I know that Acoustic Do and the Replacements would often use, you know, acoustic guitars, but when Husker Du would use acoustic guitar, it was strummed pretty fast. Like, I'm thinking of If I Can't Change, you know, or Don't Want to Know If You're Lonely, or one of those, like when they would do an acoustic version, they were still like fast songs. Where you get Never Really Been, it's like straight up country, or I guess I didn't know if you had Americana back then. I don't know if that was a term that was around yet.
You had the artists, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you still got a touch of their hardcore with like New Feelings and some other stuff, but it really is not indebted to hardcore the way that the first album is. Like this feels like a band starting shedding that and growing as songwriters. If you had to pick a song, Jay, that represented this album for people that haven't heard it, what would it be?
Ooh, there's a couple here. I guess I'll go with Ain't That Tough. I like it's doing the soft, loud thing, but in a slightly different way. So it starts to preview the the dynamic that's so popular in the 90s. And it's also, I think, up until this point in discography where it's getting the closest to the voice I'm familiar with. Like you can start to hear him like laying into that rasp and the key that song is in. You can kind of hear the voice that you later hear in the 90s. Some of the other stuff on this record and the prior record, it's a little hard to hear. Like, is this the same singer? I'm not quite sure. But I think that song you hit some notes there where you're like, oh yeah, that's Dave Pirner.
Got it. Keith, what about you? What would be your pick for a song off of this record for people to check out?
Well, I really like Ship of Fools. I think the story about, the story that it tells is just interesting. Like looking for gold and going out and getting drunk with your friends. And I just thought it was clever. Like, so I like the lyrics on Ship of Fools. I just dug that song.
There's a bunch on this record I think I would pick either Tie to the Tracks or Can't Go Back. Those are two songs that if I was going to make a mix, I think that they would go on. We're going to skip Times Incinerator unless you guys want to cover it. I don't know if you had a chance to check out the cassette.
I didn't even listen to it.
I'm sure you didn't. No, because it's not something that's like widely available. I'll just tell you that. So it's a combination of B-sides, outtakes, songs from their early years when they were called Loud Fast Rules. But we did get a third album from Soul Asylum. Look at they're like Creedence Clearwater Revival. They're putting out so many records in 1 year.
The Beatles.
Yeah, exactly. Which is While You Were Out. This comes out in later 86. This was the first record that they put out that was not produced by Bob Mould. It was produced by Chris Osgood. And this is the first record. Well, not the first record, but the Wild Hearts covered one of their songs. They have an album called Stop Us If You Heard This Before, which is an album of covers. And they covered the song The Judge from this record for that. Keith, I'll start with you. Listening to the second album of 86, what sort of growth, what caught your ear on this record?
Man, so this was honestly the first one where I was like, wow, I really liked this record. It kind of combined like power pop and garage rock. It was bouncy. There was some back and forth with the vocals, but there was ragged guitar. I really liked it. I think that it was the first time that Pirner really sounded confident in his vocals. I feel like in the second album, the vocals were kind of buried in the mix, and in the first one, he was just singing as fast as he possibly could. It sounded like. But on this album, I mean, his vocals were right out in front. And I really liked this album a lot.
Jay, what about you? What stood out for you checking out While We Were Out?
Yeah, you can hear things starting to solidify a little more. I think the records are becoming more consistent at this point. There's some really interesting guitar stuff on this album. The first track in particular, like, I don't know, there's a weird time thing going on with the drums and the guitar there that are just, again, harkening back to like more of a post-punk idea of like, trying to kind of break the 4/4 feel and try to do some other things that are a little bit more angular, which I did not expect from this band. But then you've also got things like Carry On, the kind of our big, high energy, almost anthemic, power pop-ish kind of writing, which feels, consistent with the band. So yeah, it sounds like, a natural progression of, even though it sounds like it's roughly recorded around the same time, but more cohesive, I think.
So this record, I didn't hear it like right away, obviously, when it came out. And this was one that like my roommate gave to me. I don't know why it didn't connect with me at the time, but it was when I heard they did an Unplugged, and they did Closer to the Stars on the Unplugged. And I was like, what is that song? Hearing it acoustic totally changed it for me. On the record, it's much louder and it's much more frenetic. Hearing it acoustic, you hear like what a well-written song it is. And I think that that's the difference with this album. Whereas the previous records, like, you can tell the band is getting better, but the songwriting, I feel like, leveled up. And you mentioned like Dave Pirner sounds more confident and more, he's turning into the guy who can come up with like super catchy ideas for hooks, like on Freaks and Carry On, and coming up with just interesting earworms that are not necessarily traditional in the sense of like verse, chorus, verse, chorus. Because I don't think, like, Closer to the Stars, he doesn't really get to that section until the end. And in hearing it acoustic, it was like revelatory compared to the album version. And like you, Jay, I'm still hearing a lot of the post-punk combined with like some elements of power pop, I guess, in the 80s power pop sense, not like the Matthew Sweet power pop that we're going to get. But off of this record, if I was picking one song, like Closer to the Stars would probably be the one. And then playing that with the Unplugged version, I think gives you two great versions of that track. Jay, if you were picking a song off of this record, what would it be that you would showcase for people?
Maybe Crashing Down. I just think the guitar hooks in that are just so great, so melodic and high energy. It's short, just under 2.5 minutes. Yeah, I think that's just a good, like, little compact tune that really showcases a lot of the cool guitar stuff going on here. And his voice, I think, is strong there as well.
Keith, what about you? What's the song that you're picking off this one?
I liked Lap of Luxury. I thought the lyrics were great. And I think the vocal melody really stood out for me. It was really hooky. Like, it got right in my head as soon as I started hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I really like that tune. There was a song, and I can't think of which one it was, that had a really, really cool guitar solo though. But the song passed me by. Just the guitar solo kind of perked me up a little bit, and I can't remember what song it was. But I'm gonna go with Lap of Luxury for sure.
So, like a lot of bands, Soul Asylum made their jump from an indie to a major label in the 80s. In this case, they left Twin Tone and they moved to A&M Records. And because they moved to a big record label, they got some big time producers. The producers for their 1988 album, Hang Time, Lenny Kaye, the guitarist for the Patti Smith Group, and Ed Stasium, who a producer, audio engineer for tons and tons of bands. If you have been enjoying the Replacements reissues, they have been remixed and produced by Ed Stasium. So they got those two guys to work on their major label debut. Keith, I'll start with you. What stood out for you on listening to Hang Time from '88?
Okay, so Hang Time was the only album from the 80s that I was familiar with. I've had the album for a while. I really like it. I think you get a lot of cleaner guitar sounds on this album. And again, the back and forth kind of bouncy vocals I really like. I think you're getting close to the Soul Asylum sound that we all started to love in the 90s. Like, you can tell that that's where they're going. So I just think it's again, just like the last album, like it's a more complete album. You know, it just sounds more cohesive and I like it. Yeah, that's. Yeah.
Jay, what about you? What stands out for you on Hang Time?
I have a hot take on this one, I think.
Okay.
This album stood out to me the most of all of them. It sounds the most hard rock. And a couple bands came to mind listening to it that I don't think either of you two would have thought of, but
lay it on
in particular. So this album comes out what year? 88?
Yep.
Yeah. I thought a lot. There were several songs on here and moments of songs where I thought a lot of the band Britney Fox.
Interesting.
Wow. Okay.
If you listen to Little Too Clean, even the ballad Endless Farewell, Marionette.
I'm giving back all the things that you gave to me. I'm saving up the price to pay to be free. Remember the first time you saw the rising sun. You may be done, but I have just begun. The leaves are burning and the ashes have blown away. I'm turning over new leaves almost every day. You let them think you just as soon stay. You let them think you had nothing to say. Now you want to just let you go away to find.
It sounds,
You know what's-
obviously Britney Fox is going to a much larger extreme, but if you just listen to the style of the vocal melodies, even the voice, like Britney Fox, the singer's voice is more raspy than this. Like if you took all of this and you put it through a hard rock filter and turned it up a little bit more, I think there are parts of this album and this sound that are not that dissimilar from that band. At least that's what was hitting me. I was like, oh wow, this is them like kind of stumbling into the same space some other bands at the time were stumbling into. Probably, not even realizing it, but not that dissimilar now, whatever, 30 or 40 years later. So yeah, that kind of struck me. I heard a little bit of like Enough's Enough. Like in the way they're putting together power pop and sort of these riffs and melodic ideas. Yeah, this to me sounds like a hard rock album. Like this is a band, like had they had continued down this direction, which they don't. I don't know. Sounds an awful lot like those bands.
It's funny because after I listened to this album, Long Way to Love was stuck in my head, and maybe that's why.
There you go.
I mean, really, like I'm not even making that up, but subconsciously, it's funny.
Not lyrically, but like melodically and
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
phrasings and even sounds of voices and like some of the riffs and guitar are some of the drum stuff. I know it's crazy.
Okay, well, I'm going to take a different approach and say that on this record, you hear what we all know as Soundgarden, like a song like Cartoon
Love that song.
is so Soul Asylum in terms of Grave Dancer's Union, in terms of Let Your Dim Light Shine. It's a great combination of Dave Pirner's vocal and Dan Murphy's interesting chord progressions and choices of how he's voicing things. You mentioned a couple times, Jay, that they have a little bit of a prog, influence. There are slippery little details in these songs where even in songs like Runaway Train, when you play that, there are parts where you go, oh no, it's not 4/4. Like they're cutting one bar off and they're changing the tempo to match that. You don't really pick up on it because it's so seamless. But like there are little aspects to these songs where they're messing around with time and jumping between different tempos, where they've clearly listened to a lot of music from a lot of different sources. But then you get just the pure alternative pop of a song like Cartoon.
Now everybody's looking after me. If I'm dragging by some coattail, I can't see, it's too dark. But I've got to know what's got the best of me. When the circus anthem goes on parade, in those bleacher seats of fire in your charades, too far. But I'm feeling like I don't dare look away. Don't look away. Did it almost make you feel that something's gonna happen soon? Then you wake up feeling lost in your own.
Is just like one of Dave Pirner's great vocal like melody and everything. It's funny because when the album opens, Down on Up to Me, I was like, is this Those Shoes by the Eagles? Like what's going down out, down out?
Oh man.
And it didn't hit me right away. I was like, why does that sound familiar? And I was like, oh, it's the Eagles. Which honestly, knowing how they like to cover 70s bands and sort of do a fun version of them, it wouldn't be surprised if that song came out of them jamming on Those Shoes. And then they were
Right.
like, well, wait a minute, we can do something with this part and turn it into something more. And I also found it, like you, Jay, found it fascinating that they have essentially a power ballad on this album with Endless Farewell. That was I had completely forgotten that song existed on here. So going back and hearing that was wild. And then there's again, this is a band that is not always taking things seriously. On the CD, not on the vinyl version, there is a cover of Terry Jacks' Put the Bone In.
Yep.
Terry Jacks is known for the song Seasons in the Sun. That's the most famous Terry Jacks song. So the fact that they included Put the Bone In at the end as a bonus, as the Bone Us track it's referred to as. I thought that was fun, and it shows that the band, while they are leveling up as songwriters, are not necessarily like taking themselves too seriously still. Like they're still goofing around and having fun. And they were even into the 90s, they did some great covers usually for compilations, like their Sexual Healing cover for the No Alternative soundtrack. And then I think they did a cover for the
Victoria Williams
compilation, Summer of Drugs.
Yeah.
And so Jay, you're gonna pick one song from this record as a representative of Hang Time. What are you picking?
Maybe Marionette. It's pretty ambitious, and you can kind of hear the I don't know if it's Sparks or some 70s prog pop influence going on in that song. Um, it's a lot of fun, high energy. I like the changes. I like the melody. It doesn't sound like anything else either, which is kind of cool. So yeah, Marionette.
Keith, what about you?
Well, I think I showed my hand a little bit with my enthusiasm when you mentioned it, but cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
That song is brilliant. I love that song. I put it on like back when I used to make mixed CDs. I'd put it on almost all of my mixed CDs. It's such a good song. Like, so yeah.
I forgot to mention this also features like a freaking hoedown on Twiddly D, which again, like I said, this band is not always taking things super seriously, and they're willing to like do things outside of what would be considered their sound. I've always been a fan of Sometime to Return. I put I'm sure I had that on mixed cassettes or CDs in the 80s when I had, or excuse me, in the 90s when I was able to rip them from my roommate's collection. So that would be my other pick, or that would be my pick for a song off this record. But Cartoon would be my second choice. Did you guys get to listen to Clam Dips and Other Delights, the EP?
I didn't.
Okay.
I remember I had a friend who really, really loved that EP though.
So I only mentioned it because of the iconic cover that it parodies, which is Herb Alpert's Whipped Cream and Other Delights. So apparently they had some sort of deal where they could release an EP, even though they had signed to A&M in 88, they could still release an EP on Twin Tone. So the EP that they released on Twin Tone is a mocking the A&M release, Whipped Cream and Other Delights, who at the time A&M's head was Herb Alpert. So they had Karl Mueller, who's the drummer, sit for hours and covered him with sour cream, whipped cream, paint, and seafood so they could take that picture. And they replaced the classic A&M label with the Twin Tone label on the cover. Now this is mostly just covers, and it includes like local Minnesota bands, and then they also did a couple of Janis Joplin covers and Foreigner's Jukebox Hero, nice. Which is what you would expect from Soul Asylum. It's not a faithful cover of Jukebox Hero. It is that's not on the streaming version I'm looking at. Interesting. Okay.
The version I was looking at has 6 tracks.
Yeah, there's 2 different versions based on what territory it was released in. The original US version had 6. The British version had 9, which is where you get the Janis Joplin and Foreigner covers. And then like the re-released version has everything. And then they also included some of those covers on their Times Incinerator compilation, which had come out prior to this. So some of these things have been re-released over and over again by different on different labels for different releases. So from here we get into the 90s stuff. We get And the Horse They Rode In On, which was again also released on A&M. The producer was Steve Jordan on that, who was the drummer for the Rolling Stones. And while it did okay, it didn't do...
The drummer for the Rolling Stones?
Yeah, well, Steve Jordan would fill in when Charlie Watts wasn't playing.
Yeah, I was like, hold on.
Okay.
Well, he's the backup drummer for the Rolling Stones.
Well, he's now the drummer for the Rolling Stones. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Now the drummer.
In the 80s, he was the drummer for Keith Richards and the Expensive Winos.
Okay, gotcha.
Sorry, I should have explained that.
It's like,
that's how he ended up the drummer for.
I was having a Mandela effect moment there.
What do you mean? Steve Jordan's always been the drummer for the Rolling Stones.
It's like, did Charlie Watts die in the 80s?
So, but they because it didn't do well, I guess they got dropped, and then Columbia picked them up, and then they put out their biggest album of all time with Grave Dancers Union, which would go, like #1 in the US Heat Seekers chart and number 2 in Austria, number 6 in Norway, number 4 in Sweden, number 8 in Germany. Tons of singles. Obviously, you know, everybody knows Runaway Train. It sold 2 million copies in the US. So
I just want to like remark though, between 90 and 92 and those two albums, I mean, the sonic difference, the songwriting difference, Dave's vocal performance, like it all goes up a significant couple steps, which is really seems unusual to have that deep of a catalog. I mean, almost a decade's worth of albums that are slowly progressing. And then all of a sudden they don't just like take a next step. They take like five steps to get to Grave Dancers Union. Cause once you put that on, you're like, oh shit. Like this is a platinum, you know, big time rock album.
right.
Like, everything's firing all cylinders. No more bullshit. Like they know who they are. They know how they sing. They know what the sound of the band is. You know, sonically, it sounds like a professional, like big time record. I mean, not that of course sounds bad. It's just, it's stark, the difference between the steps there. And it would make sense if Horse was the first album and there was nothing before it, and you're like, okay, yeah, I get it. You know, they're sort of figuring themselves out, and boom, they have a catalog that deep. And then suddenly, you know, 10 years into your career, or 11, it would have been, right? You said they started in 81?
81, 83 is when they became Soul Asylum, but 81 is when they all like got together first time.
I mean, really didn't figure it out for 11 years.
Yeah.
If you really want to put it that way, at least commercially, to say like, no, this is boom, this is who we are, and this is what our legacy is going to be based on. It took them 11 years to get there, and bands are not going to get that chance. At least it doesn't seem to be anymore.
And Dave Pirner was born in 64. So when they got together in 81, he was 17 when they started. I mean, and they were 19 when they like Soul Asylum became a thing. And Dave Murphy's 2 years older than him. So I mean, they were pretty close in age. And Karl Mueller was right between. He was born in 63. So they're all within 1 year of each other. They're all teenagers when they start playing, and they're all essentially in their, you know, teens, early 20s, writing songs together and spending the whole decade writing songs together and touring and jamming and stuff like that. So you're right, though. It does make a huge leap on Grave Dancers Union. I think probably some of that is Michael Beinhorn. The production is perfect on that record.
Yeah.
It really makes me, this would be a perfect band to either go back and do what they did with that Replacements album, where that was totally remixed and like represented, or even, I think I would, and I don't say this about many bands, but like I would be open to them like re-recording some of this stuff. And not don't get too crazy messing with it, but just like give it a modern production or in some of these songs, like I think the production seems appropriate, and other songs are like the production's clearly limiting the song. Like it could be so much cooler. Now that I know what the band can sound like, you know, from Grave Dancers Union forward, there's a big chunk of that catalog in the 80s that would sound really cool if it was either completely remixed and remastered or even reperformed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't get a chance to do it earlier, but I want to share Kyle Bittner, who was hopefully going to join us, but he couldn't. One of our patrons, he wasn't able to join us. He said, "There's always been something about Soul Asylum that has appealed to me, regardless of the decade, more or less. Initially, I only liked Black Gold, which is on Grave Dancers Union, but eventually I loved the majority of their albums, even Let Your Dim Light Shine. To this day, covers of Summer of Drugs and Sexual Healing are two of the most underrated covers of the 90s. That said, when I went back about 20 odd years ago and discovered the rough edges of Husker Du and the Replacements, always played prominent in the Soul Asylum's music. Even though their later music was much more polished and mainstream, Ahem, Misery, Tracks like Cartoon, Veil of Tears are choice singles from the 80s albums. Other standout tracks include We Three, All the King's Men, Sometime to Return, and Ship of Fools. I believe that We Three and All the King's Men are on
Yeah, they're on
and the Horse You Rode
and the
In.
Horse.
Yeah. But yeah, and you know, I have actually gone back and sort of reassessed Let Your Dim Light Shine because, you know, Soul Asylum was huge because of Runaway Train, to the point where I got sick of Runaway Train. And I was like, I don't need to hear this song again.
Yeah.
I could only start listening to that song recently, but I loved Black Gold and I loved Someone a Shove, and not, there's a song in the back end of the record, 98.9%, that I really
Great
love. But it wasn't until recently that I went back to Let Your Dim Light Shine. I was like, you know what? Misery is a good song. It's a well-constructed, interesting single. Again, it has a sneakily difficult part. When they do that part that I got just what you need, like that's a weird,
interesting time signature.
a weird time signature right in the middle, what is essentially the pre-chorus of the song.
Yeah.
And
that hook is very unique too, the way it emerges out of that verse, and you're like, whoa, this is, I always thought it was a super interesting song, and like,
Did you guys
excited about the band?
Did you guys catch the callback to Runaway Train in that song? Because that was the first thing I noticed. Like right before they go into the chorus, they play the little guitar part that's in Runaway Train.
That din, 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 din,
Yeah.
din. Yep.
Yeah.
It's just a 5 seconds of the lead.
Yeah, I was like, hey, like that's from what. But yeah, that song. I remember that song from Clerks. You know.
Yeah.
And then they're all playing hockey on the rooftop in the video. It was cool. I like that song a lot. So
I as well. And the other single, what big single was Just Like Anyone, which had I think Claire Danes was in the video for that single. But I actually went back and I really enjoyed quite a bit of that record. String of Pearls is a really interesting story song.
Yeah.
Promises Broken leans in, which was co-written by Mark Perlman from the Jayhawks, leans into a little bit of the Golden Smog sound that they were doing at the time in the mid 90s, when there was like this nice conglomeration of Minnesota and Midwestern artists all like jamming together. So and that album was produced by Butch Vig, which is I did not realize that until I looked at it. I don't get anything from that record that go, oh, this is a Butch Vig album, in comparison to like, you know, Nirvana or Smashing Pumpkins or something like that. Like it doesn't have that.
This stuff's usually bigger.
Yes.
You know? Yeah.
And then it has Andy Wallace's mixer and Howie Weinberg is mastering. So you have all the big names for that record, which of course makes sense because they're following up just a massive, huge record. And Misery did go to #1 on the US modern rock charts. It just did not sell as much as it sold like half as much as Gravedancer's Union, but you know, that's going to happen. There's nothing you can do about that, really.
Well, I remember Down on the Upside was a disappointment to A&M, and it sold millions of records, and it was everywhere. You know, like you couldn't go anywhere without hearing Burden in My Hand. Like that song was just massive and pretty new. And they were just like, you guys let us down. You know, it's insane how record labels were, you know, in the mid 90s.
Yeah, they were expecting every record had to make more. It was the quarterly report time for, you know, every record had to be bigger than the next one and that sort of thing. And there's no slumps allowed.
If you go back and look at Soundgarden's catalog, did you really expect another Black Hole Sun? You know,
that's right.
Yeah,
same
unrealistic.
Same thing with Gravedancer's Union. The odds you're going to get another
Runaway Train.
Yeah. I mean, that was a cultural moment. That video was a very specific cultural moment with, you know, there were a couple of those where you had zeitgeist, I would say, videos like Right Now by Van Halen was like a zeitgeist where people,
for sure,
everybody who
it
knew
all
that
came together.
Yeah, everyone who watched MTV saw that video.
Yeah.
Well, we don't really have a Where the Album Better EP or decent single on here. But if you're going to pick a record, let's wrap it up this way. If you're going to pick a record for someone of their 4 big records, we're not going to count the compilations or the EPs, but of the 4 records in the 80s from Soul Asylum, which is the one that you're going to point to people and say, that's the one? If you want to get an idea of what the 80s were for Soul Asylum, this is probably the album you should check out. Keith, what would you say?
Well, if I'm going to encompass everything that they did kind of colliding together, it would be While You Were Out. My favorite album, though, is Hang Time. So, but if you want to sort of meet in the middle of the punk stuff that they were doing, progressing into the more alternative rock stuff that they would do later on, While You Were Out would probably be it.
Okay. Jay, what about you? What would be your pick?
I think I would go with Hang Time. It gets to you can hear the roots, you can hear the energy, but it also is familiar enough, I think, with the 90s band that's a little more commercial and, hard rock, classic rock oriented, that it's should be familiar and accessible. It's the one I have the one I enjoyed the most and have the most tracks highlighted for too.
Got it. I agree with both of you. Hang Time and While You Were Out. If I had to pick one or the other, I'm going to go with While You Were Out, just because I think you get a little bit more of the rawness, but you still get the songwriting. So you get an idea of that 80s sound that is unique to that era, without it being overly hardcore, without it being overly Bob Mould production. So this gives you just like what does Marissa call it? The plutonic ideal for the band. Like this is the plutonic ideal for their 80s output. So we need to thank everybody who voted in the poll. We're glad we got to talk about Soul Asylum. Maybe someday we'll talk about one of their 90s albums in the
We've talked.
I think
more
I
about the
nominated
latest
in the horse. They're dropped in and the horse they rode in on, but
yeah, that one.
I think my picks are so far back that who knows when they're going to start popping up. But
we got a lot of picks in those hoppers, and they're always gonna, we'll get to it eventually. And we need to thank all those folks who voted, and thanks all the folks at Patreon who left comments and whatnot for this episode. If you would like to be like our patrons, like Keith, who has his own podcast, what tell us about your podcast?
So Most Excellent Entertainment, where I interview various people involved in the entertainment business and talk to them about their progression through the business of entertainment and what keeps them creating. It drops every Tuesday at 5 a.m. I actually have a commitment from a very big, in my opinion anyway, 90s, early 2000s rock star that should be dropping in November or December, but I can't really talk to him and talk. I'm not going to announce it until we've actually done
Chris
the
Martin? Is it Chris
Martin?
Martin's
got a new album
man.
to promote.
Back up a little bit.
Oasis?
No, it's not
Is it
Oasis.
Noel Gallagher?
It is not Noel Gallagher. Okay, maybe he's not as big of a rock star as I'm thinking, but he's huge in my mind. So
Nice.
Yeah.
Coming
from a little bit of experience, don't announce that until they show up.
yeah, I'm not
exactly.
going to. I'm not announcing it until we do the interview, but I'm excited.
Right, exactly. Trust.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've gone down that road.
We've gotten bit by that.
Yes,
Yeah.
Nash Cato.
Yeah.
And anyway,
Didn't someone from King's X stand you guys up like twice? Or am I thinking of
that might have happened.
That might happen. We'll talk about that on the Discord.
Gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. I'm pretty sure anybody who dissed us is not listening to the podcast. So
Probably
I'm
not.
not.
I don't want to. There's fans of those bands, and
Well, we got to start
Yeah,
an internet. We got to start an internet rumble with somebody just to get some attention.
you're right. We're bad at this.
Remember the Twitter wars?
Oh,
That's how you get noticed.
I know. We're bad at this whole
we are.
grudge
We are.
thing.
So you can go to dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com to join the union and vote in polls like our 80s Origins polls, all sorts of our roundtable polls, plus our monthly album review polls, which are submitted by anybody, the albums that is, at digmeoutpodcast.com at the suggest an album page. Anyone can go there. They can suggest albums for our 90s rock podcast, our 80s metal podcast, which will have a new episode this week, the same week that this episode drops. There'll be a new 80s metal podcast. And you can check those out by going to Substack and listening, or the Box newsletter, which comes out every week, listing new releases of 80s, 90s, and aughts relevant music, books, documentaries, TV shows, etc. Jay, did you do the review for Nothing But a Good Time, that documentary based on the book?
Mm-hmm. It was a compilation of me, other comments from Discord, and then scouring the internet for other reviews.
Gotcha. And if you want to read that, you just get the Box newsletter. It's delivered to your email inbox, nice and clean like that. You don't have to look at your actual mailbox and pop open a letter or anything like that. We send it right to your email inbox. No carrier pigeons involved. Lastly, Apple Podcasts is where you go to leave positive feedback for the show. So for Jay,
maybe in the spirit of Game of Thrones, we'll start sending ravens.
That would be nice.
The new episode's coming. We sent a raven.
Yeah,
a raven
Look
is on
to
its
the
way. All right, for Jay, I'm Tim. We're out. We'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.
Someone's calling.